Karen's face twisted with rage as she stormed up the driveway, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. "This is an outrage," she bellowed, her voice carrying across the quiet suburban street. She marched up to the front door of the modest home and began pounding on it furiously. "Open up. I know you're in there," she yelled, her knuckles reddening from the force of her blows. The homeowner, a young couple in their 30s, cautiously peered through the window, their eyes wide with alarm. Suddenly, the front door flew open, and Karen thrust her index finger mere inches from the man's face. "You have some nerve, putting up that ridiculous fence on your property," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "It's an eyesore, and it's blocking the neighborhood's access to the public green space behind your house." The man, taken aback by the woman's sudden and aggressive outburst, stammered, "But, ma'am, that fence is on my private property. I have a right to put it up." Karen's nostrils flared, and her eyes narrowed to slits. "Your private property," she scoffed. "This entire neighborhood belongs to all of us. You don't get to just section off a piece of it for your own selfish use." The man's wife, who had been standing behind him, stepped forward, her brow furrowed in confusion. "But, Mrs. Jenkins, the green space behind our house is owned by the Homeowners Association. We paid a premium for this lot specifically because it backs up to that open area." Karen let out a harsh, mirthless laugh. "The HOA? Ha! I ******* the who, and I'm telling you that your fence is coming down. Today." She turned on her heel and stomped back to her car, leaving the stunned couple staring after her in disbelief. As she drove away, Karen's mind raced. This was her neighborhood, her domain. How dare these newcomers try to stake a claim on what rightfully belonged to the community? She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. This was war. The next morning, Karen was up before the sun, poring over the HOA bylaws and covenants. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the fine print, searching for any loopholes or technicalities she could exploit. "Aha!" she exclaimed, a devious grin spreading across her face. According to the rules, any structures or modifications to individual properties had to be approved by the HOA board. And guess who chaired that board? Karen triumphantly tapped her finger on the relevant section, her mind already whirring with the plan of attack. She hurried to her car and drove to the young couple's home, arriving just as they were getting ready to leave for work. Before they could react, she marched up to their door and thrust a stack of papers into the man's hands. "Here are the HOA violation notices. You have 30 days to remove that eyesore of a fence, or we'll do it for you and bill you for the cost," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. The man's face fell, and his wife let out a frustrated sigh. "Mrs. Jenkins, this is ridiculous. We followed all the proper procedures and got approval for that fence. You can't just override that decision." Karen's smile widened, and she leaned in closer. "Oh, but I can, dear. As the chairperson of the HOA board, I have the authority to review and overturn any decisions made by the previous board. And trust me, this fence is going." The couple exchanged a worried glance, their earlier confidence now replaced by uncertainty. Karen savored the moment, relishing the power she held over them. "You have 30 days, she reiterated, her tone leaving no room for argument. With that, she turned and sauntered back to her car, feeling a sense of triumph. As she drove away, Karen couldn't help but chuckle to herself. These newcomers had no idea what they were up against. She was the queen of this neighborhood, and no one was going to challenge her reign. The young couple, still reeling from their confrontation with Karen, sat in stunned silence. Their dream home, which they had painstakingly renovated and customized to their liking, now felt like a battleground. "I can't believe she's doing this," the wife, Sarah, said, her voice quivering with a mix of anger and disbelief. "We followed all the rules, and now she's just going to steamroll over us." Her husband, Tom, ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed in worry. I don't know what to do. She's the HOA chairperson, and she's clearly abusing her power. We can't just roll over and let her have her way. Sarah's eyes narrowed, and a determined expression crossed her face. Well, we're not going to. This is our home, and we have rights. We're going to fight her on this. The couple spent the rest of the day researching their options, scouring the HOA bylaws, and reaching out to other neighbors. They discovered that Karen's actions were in clear violation of the rules, and they decided to take their case to the rest of the HOA board. That evening, they attended the monthly HOA meeting, their nerves on edge. As soon as the meeting began, Sarah stood up and addressed the board. "Excuse me, everyone. I'm here to file a formal complaint against Mrs. Jenkins, the HOA chairperson. She has issued a violation notice for our fence, even though we followed all the proper procedures and received approval from the previous board." The other board members exchanged puzzled glances, and one of them, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Fitzgerald, spoke up. "That's highly irregular, Mrs. Levinson. As far as I'm aware, the previous board's decisions are binding unless there are extenuating circumstances." Karen, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly rose to her feet, her eyes narrowed. "Actually, Mr. Fitzgerald, as the current chairperson, I have the authority to review and overturn any decisions made by the previous board." The room erupted in murmurs, and Tom stood up, his voice firm. "But that's a clear abuse of power, Mrs. Jenkins. You can't just arbitrarily decide to remove our fence because you don't like it." Karen's lips curled into a sneer. "We'll see about that," she said, her gaze fixed on the young couple. The HOA meeting descended into chaos as the other board members began to question Karen's actions. Some supported the young couple, while others seemed hesitant to challenge the formidable Karen. Tom and Sarah watched anxiously as the debate unfolded, their hearts pounding with a mix of hope and trepidation. They knew that their fate rested in the hands of these people, and they couldn't afford to lose. Finally, Mr. Fitzgerald, the elder statesman of the board, raised his hand and called for order. "Let's all take a moment to review the facts and the bylaws," he said, his tone measured and calm. The room fell silent as he turned to Karen. "Mrs. Jenkins, I understand your concerns about the aesthetics of the neighborhood, but the previous board's approval of the Levinsons' fence was valid and binding. Unless there are clear and documented violations of the covenants, we cannot simply override their decision." Karen's face flushed with anger, and she opened her mouth to protest, but Mr. Fitzgerald raised his hand to silence her. "Furthermore, as the chairperson, you have a duty to act in the best interests of the entire community, not just your own personal preferences. Overturning this decision without just cause would be a breach of that duty." The other board members murmured their agreement, and Tom and Sarah felt a surge of relief. They had found an unlikely ally in the form of the principled Mr. Fitzgerald. However, Karen was not about to go down without a fight. She glared at the board members, her eyes narrowed to slits. "Fine, but mark my words, this isn't over. I'll be reviewing every single decision made by this HOA, and I won't hesitate to take action if I find any other irregularities." With that, she stormed out of the meeting, leaving the rest of the board members to clean up the mess. Tom and Sarah exchanged a relieved glance, but they knew that the battle was far from over. Karen was a formidable opponent, and they would have to remain vigilant to protect their home and their rights. In the days following the explosive HOA meeting, Tom and Sarah's lives were consumed by the ongoing conflict with Karen. They spent countless hours poring over the HOA covenants and bylaws, determined to uncover any weaknesses in Karen's position. Meanwhile, Karen was not idle. She had begun scrutinizing every decision made by the previous HOA board, searching for any perceived infractions or irregularities that she could exploit. One afternoon, as Tom was working in the yard, he noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Karen, her face set in a stern expression. "Mr. Levinson," she began, her voice dripping with false civility, "I've been reviewing the HOA records, and it appears there may be some issues with the architectural modifications you made to your home." Tom felt a knot forming in the pit of his stomach. "What are you talking about, Mrs. Jenkins? We followed all the proper procedures and got approval for those changes." Karen's lips curled into a smug smile. "Ah, but that's where you're mistaken. It seems the previous board failed to properly document and approve some of those modifications, and according to the bylaws, that means they're in violation and need to be remedied." Tom's heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. If Karen could prove that their home renovations were unapproved, it could give her the ammunition she needed to take even more drastic action. "This is outrageous," Sarah exclaimed, having overheard the exchange from the porch. "We followed every single rule, and now you're trying to twist the facts to suit your own agenda." Karen's expression remained impassive. "I'm simply doing my job as the HOA chairperson, Mrs. Levinson. It's my responsibility to ensure that all properties in this neighborhood adhere to the covenants and guidelines. If you've violated those, then you'll need to rectify the situation." Tom and Sarah exchanged a worried glance, realizing that their fight with Karen was quickly escalating. They knew they had to find a way to counter her accusations, or risk losing their hard-earned home. Determined to defend their home, Tom and Sarah enlisted the help of a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. After reviewing the evidence, the attorney assured them that they had a strong case. "Mrs. Jenkins is clearly overstepping her authority and abusing her position as chairperson," the attorney explained. "The modifications you made were properly approved, and there's no valid reason for her to be targeting you like this." The couple felt a sense of relief, but they knew the battle was far from over. Karen was a formidable opponent, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. In the following weeks, the legal battle intensified. Karen continued to dig through the HOA records, searching for any perceived infractions she could use against the Levinsons. Meanwhile, Tom and Sarah's attorney worked tirelessly to refute her claims and protect their rights. During a tense HOA board meeting, the attorney presented his findings, methodically dismantling Karen's accusations one by one. The other board members, some of whom had been swayed by Karen's persistent lobbying, began to waver in their support for her. Karen, her face flushed with anger, tried to interrupt the attorney's presentation, but he refused to be silenced. "Mrs. Jenkins, your attempts to selectively enforce the HOA covenants are clear violations of your duty as chairperson. You're using your position to harass and intimidate the Levinsons, and that's simply unacceptable." The room erupted in murmurs, and several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karen's grip on the gavel tightened, her knuckles turning white. Sensing an opportunity, the attorney continued, "If the board fails to take appropriate action to rein in Mrs. Jenkins' abuses, we will have no choice but to pursue legal action against the HOA. And I can assure you, the costs and consequences will be significant." The threat of legal action seemed to have the desired effect, and the board members began to voice their concerns about Karen's behavior. Tom and Sarah watched the proceedings with a mixture of hope and trepidation, knowing that the outcome would determine the fate of their cherished home. The tension in the HOA boardroom was palpable as the members debated how to handle the escalating conflict with Karen. Some argued that they needed to rein in her behavior, while others remained loyal to her and her aggressive tactics. Tom and Sarah sat on the edge of their seats, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They knew that the fate of their home hung in the balance, and they couldn't afford to lose. Finally, Mr. Fitzgerald, the elder statesman of the board, stood up and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe it's time we take a step back and consider the bigger picture here." The room fell silent as the other members turned their attention to him. Mrs. Jenkins, you've made it clear that you're willing to use your position as chairperson to pursue your own personal agenda, even at the expense of the community's well-being. That is a clear violation of your duties and responsibilities." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Mr. Fitzgerald raised his hand to silence her. "I'm not finished. The Levinsons have presented clear evidence that they followed all the proper procedures and received the necessary approvals for their home renovations. Your attempts to undermine their rights as homeowners is unacceptable and, quite frankly, an abuse of power." The other board members murmured their agreement, and Karen's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Therefore," Mr. Fitzgerald continued, "I motion that we immediately remove Mrs. Jenkins from her position as chairperson and replace her with a more impartial and ethical leader who will put the needs of the entire community first." The room erupted in a flurry of activity as the other board members debated the motion. Tom and Sarah watched with bated breath, hardly daring to believe that their ordeal might finally be coming to an end. After a tense deliberation, the board voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position. As she was escorted out of the room, her face twisted with rage, Tom and Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. They had won the battle, but they knew that the war was far from over. The future of their home and their community hung in the balance, and they would have to remain vigilant to protect what was rightfully theirs. In the aftermath of Karen's removal from the HOA board, Tom and Sarah breathed a collective sigh of relief. The constant stress and anxiety of the past few months had taken a toll, and they were grateful to finally have a moment of peace. However, their victory was bittersweet. They knew that Karen would not go down without a fight, and they feared that she might retaliate in ways they couldn't even imagine. True to their instincts, it wasn't long before the first signs of trouble emerged. Rumors began to circulate throughout the neighborhood, whispers of a disgruntled former HOA chairperson who was determined to undermine the community's well-being. Sarah grew increasingly paranoid, constantly scanning the street for any sign of Karen's presence. Tom, ever the voice of reason, tried to reassure her that the board had taken the necessary steps to protect them. "She's not going to get away with this, Sarah," he said, wrapping his arms around her. "We've got the law on our side, and the rest of the HOA board is firmly behind us." But Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of her stomach. "I don't know, Tom. Karen is ruthless, and she's not going to let this go without a fight. I'm worried that she's going to try something even more drastic." Their fears were realized a few weeks later when they received a notice in the mail. It was a lawsuit filed by Karen against the HOA, alleging that the board's decision to remove her was unlawful and that the Levinsons' home renovations were in violation of the covenants. Tom and Sarah's hearts sank as they read through the legal documents, their hard-won victory suddenly feeling like a fragile illusion. "We can't let her win, Tom," Sarah said, her voice shaking with determination. "This is our home, and we're not going to let her take it away from us." Steeling themselves for another round of legal battles, the Levinsons prepared to defend their home and their community once more, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. The war with Karen was far from over, and they would have to be more vigilant than ever to protect what was rightfully theirs.